A fly wounds the water, but the wound soon heals. Swallows tilt and twitter overhead, dropping now and then toward the outward radiating evidence of food. The green haze on the trees changes into leaves, and what looks like smoke floating over the neighbor's barn is only apple blossoms.
Mm.
But sometimes what looks like disaster is disaster. The day comes at last, and the men struggle with the casket, just clearing the pews. So taking a comfortable seat, straightening the back, lengthening the neck, maybe loosening the muscles in the neck and in the shoulders. Sort of feeling the moment appear before your eyes. Maybe your hands face up on your lap and your eyes closed or half closed. Putting the focus of your inner awareness in the space between your eyebrows. And then letting everything just fall around that beam of light between the gut up to that point of awareness. There's a giant wooden Buddha in Nara in Japan in a deer park that sits just like this amidst all the changing. Softening the muscles of the jaw and straightening the back again a little bit if you find yourself leaning forward, softening the shoulders. And letting the moment again appear just before you. Lengthening the breath to 4 counts in and 5 counts out with a little pause at the peak. And in the Tonglen practice, you're taking in the suffering of others. Maybe someone who's suffering you can't relieve, though you desire to. And then breathing it out past 4 counts, one more count as though to release it all. Four counts in, a little pause at the peak. And 5 counts out. Now we're in it. Just churning that lead into gold in the forge of the heart. And then bringing your breathing back to a comfortable pace. And if your thoughts are there, rushing around, you're thinking about what to do today or what's next, you're present enough to notice them. That's what this meditation is for, just to bring you back to notice whatever it is that's flying around in your inner trees or across the surface of your inner pond. Here's Jane Kenyon's The Pond at Dusk. A fly wounds the water, but the wound soon heals. Swallows tilt and twitter overhead, dropping now and then toward the outward radiating evidence of food. The green haze on the trees changes into leaves, and what looks like smoke floating over the neighbor's barn is only apple blossoms. But sometimes what looks like disaster is disaster. The day comes at last, and the men struggle with the casket, just clearing the pews. I've talked about When Evening Comes, which is perhaps the best known of Jane Kenyon's poems, along with Having It Out with Melancholy, which is about depression. And we know Jane Kenyon as the Akhmatova of our late 20th century. She died in 1995, very young at 47. And she was the wife of Donald Hall, who at the time was a more famous poet than she was. But as history often does, things have shifted quite a bit, and her powers have really come to the fore as the great poet of that family, at least in my opinion. But Alice Madison, who became a novelist, was a friend of hers and wrote this about Jane's frustration in the early and mid years of her career. Alice says, Jane was quick to dismiss other people's failures, but temperamentally unable to put aside her own, whether because of depression, her dour, pious grandmother, or some other cause. If a magazine rejected my work, it was because the editors were idiots. If it rejected hers, maybe she wasn't any good. Hearing that makes a lot of sense to me, because in Jane Kenyon especially, there is this insistent voice, always wanting to know what's real, what's real, what's real. And this poem, like 3 haiku, is asking and studying what's real. So you see in this poem that there are 3 disturbances on the surfaces of things. The first is a disturbance on the pond at dusk. And the poem is called The Pond at Dusk, not the casket in the church. And it's not called The Apple Blossoms I Thought Were Smoke. So we know that this disturbance on the pond at dusk is really the center point of the poem. But it's a fly that wounds the water, but the wound soon heals. So in each of these disturbances, there's a twist of sorts. We think we know what's happening, but then there's a twist. The fly wounds the water, and the wound soon heals. And what happens from that wounding is a disturbance that radiates outward, and it alerts the swallows that there's food nearby. It's a very Christ-like image, the fly wounding the water, and the wound healing, and the radiating energies outward are our spiritual food. Only here it's a fly. So there's the mourning for the fly that is fallen, but there's also this sense of praise for the ways that nature alerts nature of nourishment nearby. Where is the reality here? What is real? What's real is that, the nourishment continues, that creative force continues. The next stanza does the same thing. The green haze on the trees changes into leaves, and what looks like smoke floating over the neighbor's barn is only apple blossoms. So the first image is Christ-like to me. The second image reminds me of one of the stories of the Buddha, where in the Buddha's temptation, the soldiers are coming at him while he's sitting under the banyan tree, and it's an image of fear. But as soon as he lets go of that fear, they turn into flowers. Their swords and spears turn into blossoms. And then the third, also very interesting, but sometimes what looks like disaster is disaster. The poem is not Pollyanna in the way that it tries to erase the suffering that is pervasive through the world. It also names it, which I admire so much. Sometimes disaster is disaster. For my friends who are going through disaster right now, the day comes at last, and the men struggle with the casket, just clearing the pews. There's a struggle in this stanza. There's loss. But look what happens with that casket. Isn't it similar to the floating apple blossoms? And isn't it similar to the fly that's floating on the water that becomes the nourishment? The casket is like a boat that's being carried by others. So there too, there's a reality that's being discerned that is sustaining. and also nourishing, by the way that we care for each other and carry each other. Thich Nhat Hanh has a poem about a wooden Buddha that is standing in a temple completely decimated by bombs, by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. And he describes this Buddha sitting there impassive amidst all of this decimation. And I think that this poem is a little bit like that. It's trying to find the Buddha standing impassive amidst all of the loss. Not to say that the loss is meaningless, but to say that Buddha nature does not change amidst the impermanence, that Buddha nature is always there and can always be drummed up or found or uncovered. And the diamond, continues. One more thing about this poem is that it's called The Pond at Dusk. It begins with the pond at dusk, but isn't it interesting that you can just read it round and round? It ends on, but sometimes what looks like disaster is disaster. What if the poem began there? Sometimes what looks like disaster is disaster. The day comes at last, and the men struggle with the casket, just clearing the pews. A fly wounds the water, but the wound soon heals. Swallows tilt and twitter overhead, dropping now and then toward the outward radiating evidence of food. The green haze on the trees changes into leaves, and what looks like smoke floating over the neighbor's barn is only apple blossoms. This poem could end on any one of its stanzas, depending on where we want the focus to be. And I have this experience in every aspect of my life. I have a good night of teaching, and I wake up the next day thinking I'm a good teacher. Or I have a horrible teaching experience, and I think, why did I even get into this business? It's impossible. Or something bad happens, and I begin to see the universe through those lenses of disaster. Or something turns out right, even when I try to destroy it. And I see that there is this engendering, powerful, loving force behind everything. But we can't make the mistake of judging the world based on the last thing that happened. Like as a poet, I can't judge my entire work as a poet based on the last bad poem that I wrote. I can't say that I'm a bad poet because I wrote a bad poem, or that the world is falling to pieces because today the world is falling to pieces. It takes real resistance. It's a quest for reality that is behind the poet's works that I love the most. It's the quest for what's real, beyond what appears to be happening just now. So here it is one more time, the pond at dusk. A fly wounds the water, but the wound soon heals. Swallows tilt and twitter overhead, dropping now and then toward the outward radiating evidence of food. The green haze on the trees changes into leaves, and what looks like smoke floating over the neighbor's barn is only apple blossoms. But sometimes what looks like disaster is disaster. The day comes at last, and the men struggle with the casket, just clearing the pews. Let's sit back. Your hands facing up on your lap. For me, again, what I always forget is here in the neck and in the shoulders. Everything softens, and then I have this iron will that I'm trying to hold up the world with on my shoulders. Just let them fall for a minute. Let the muscles of the face relax. Look with the awareness that pours out of that space between your eyebrows. If there's a disturbance in your body right now, is it smoke from a fire or is it apple blossoms? If you made a mistake recently and you're blaming yourself for wounding the water or for failing somehow, how is that mistake going to ripple out in ways that could lead to sustenance for someone else? This is one of Thich Nhat Hanh's poems. Homage to Shakyamuni Buddha, whose great vows and compassion inspire us. I am determined to cultivate only thoughts that increase trust and love, to use my hands to perform only deeds that build community, to speak only words of harmony and aid. I'm determined to cultivate only thoughts that increase trust and love, to use my hands to perform only deeds that build community, to speak only words of harmony and aid. What this poem asks of me is to be that wooden Buddha amid all the devastation of the temple. And in the last few minutes, just a little rain practice around that. So find that place of disturbance I asked you to look for earlier, whether it's the fly or the smoke that becomes apple blossoms or the real disaster. Where do you feel that in your body? Is it in your shoulders or in your heart, in your gut, which is where it begins for me? Just find the locus of that. And then allow a space for it. It started with Ram Dass that this too belongs. That there's space for this too. Before you excise it or judge it or blame it. And then gently to name it, to investigate what it is. Worry, panic, embarrassment. Now you have my big three. That's the decimated temple. And then there's a force in you that's capable from behind all that to nurture it. That's the Buddha who sits unchanged through all of this change. It's so beautiful, the pond at dusk. The pond at dusk. A fly wounds the water, but the wound soon heals. Swallows tilt and twitter overhead, dropping now and then toward the outward radiating evidence of food. The green haze on the trees changes into leaves, and what looks like smoke floating over the neighbor's barn is only apple blossoms. But sometimes what looks like disaster is disaster. The day comes at last, and the men struggle with the casket, just clearing the pews. Thank you, everyone.